Welcome back, everyone, to another reaction video. Well, it is the day after Thanksgiving here in the United States. It's actually the Thanksgiving day for me and my family because my kids were with mom yesterday, so we're making it today. I'm actually just getting ready to put the turkey in the oven and excited to be cooking Thanksgiving dinner for myself and my kids for the first time ever, so hopefully it goes well. With that in mind, I thought it'd be a great time to talk about one of the stories connected to what we recognize as the first Thanksgiving here in the United States, which is the story of the Mayflower. So this is a channel I have not done a reaction to before, nor have I seen any of his stuff, but it was recommended to me. It's called What If the Mayflower Didn't Reach America? Now, we do these what-if scenarios, these alternate history scenarios every so often because I think it's a unique lens through which to view actual history by talking about the importance of that event as it relates to what came after. So by talking about what might have changed, we recognize the importance of the original event as it did happen. So I'll put the link down in the description. This channel is called Videntis. He's got about 42,000 subscribers, so if we like what we see, definitely please consider subscribing to them and recommend to me any other videos you might see on the channel that sound interesting. With all of that in mind, I wanted to let you know that if you are a patron or a channel member at any level, we do now have a private Discord server that's been set up by a couple of our very loyal followers of this channel who have been active for a long time in moderating on live streams and have helped me in the past moderate on Discord. And they set up a Discord server that is private. It's only available to our patrons and members. That makes it a little more manageable for us because the last time we had a Discord server, there were like 7,000 people in there, and it got really, really difficult to manage. And it just became too much, and that's why we decided to discontinue it. So this way, we can have something, but we can keep it a little smaller. Between Discord members, or between members and patrons, right now we've got about 800. So that's the max number we would have on Discord. So if you want to sign up for a membership or Patreon at any level, you can get the link to the Discord server and join us over there. I'll try to be as active as I can. Let's go ahead and dive into this video.
Every American has heard the tale of the Mayflower, which is in many respects our mythologized founding akin to Rome's Aeneid. Brave pilgrims escaped corrupt religious persecution from monarchist Europe in 1620 to found a society based on moral Christian values in the new Promised Land, symbolizing God's protection and endorsement over their ventures. A treacherous voyage across the Atlantic left the pilgrims weak and depleted, but they persevered. All the men signed the Mayflower Compact, which President Calvin Coolidge, a descendant of those first pilgrims, perfectly described. The compact which they signed was an event of the greatest importance. It was the foundation of liberty based on law and order, and that tradition has been steadily upheld. They drew up a form of government which has been designated as the first real constitution of modern times. It was democratic, in acknowledgement of liberty under law and order, and they giving to each person the right to participate in the government, while they
each male person,
promised to be obedient to the laws.
Free male person.
Despite the initial fervor, the harsh New England winter threatened the future of the Plymouth colony.
Yeah, so looks like he's kind of giving the intro, so I want to let him finish that and see where he's going with it before we stop and kind of comment on all of it.
Which barely survived due to help from native tribes. In 1621, the Pilgrims and Indians grew closer together through Squanto, a kind-hearted Indian who felt pity for the hardworking colonists, showing them many native practices critical of the Plymouth survival.
And what's interesting is, a lot of people think that this is the first real presence of Englishmen, so to speak, in this part of the world, with Plymouth coming, the Plymouth colony here in 1620, and of course Jamestown had been founded in 1607, and you had St. Augustine for the Spanish down in Florida in the late 1500s. But Squanto speaks English. And why does he speak English? Because he spent a lot of time with English-speaking people who had been there previously. They had just not settled in a permanent settlement. There had been fur traders and trappers and people who had come and explored, but nobody who had permanently settled.
Dominating in the first Thanksgiving. In time, Plymouth grew into a strong and prosperous colony that gave English settlers a foothold on the continent, and in turn, birthed the American spirit. So join me, your 41,000 patriots and the 90% who haven't subscribed yet. History is forever changed in 1620, as the Mayflower was lost during the Atlantic Passage.
All right, so first let's talk a little bit more about what actually happened. So he talked a little bit about, the common story is, of course, they're fleeing persecution, and that is true to a degree. Remember that that England in this time is basically a one religion place. It's got a state religion, which is the Church of England. And so if you are outside of the Church of England, you're still required, for example, to pay tithes to your local parish church. And other religions, other versions of Christianity or other religions as a whole are nominal. I mean, they're permitted to exist, but there's a lot of persecution. There's a lot of kind of stamping down on those things. And so some of these folks go to Leiden, Holland for a while in the Netherlands, and but then they eventually come back, and there's a whole long story behind all of that stuff. There are a lot of different religious groups who decide they want to leave England for various reasons. Myself, I have not only an ancestor that was a couple of ancestors who were connected to this, but on my paternal side, one of my direct ancestors was severely beaten and imprisoned for being a Quaker, and eventually came to New Jersey to help set up New Jersey, and then, of course, they settled Pennsylvania. And so a lot of these colonies are set up from people who are not persecuted in the sense that they're being executed because they are not Church of England, but because they feel like they can't freely practice their faith without government intervention. But not everybody on the Mayflower is coming for that reason. There are adventurers. There are people who are looking for other reasons. And there were two ships originally. There was the Mayflower and the Speedwell. The Speedwell was a little smaller. It kept springing a leak. They made it so far on the journey, had to turn around, repair Speedwell, go back again, decided Speedwell wasn't going to make it, so they loaded some of the people from the Speedwell onto the Mayflower, and the rest had to go back, including my ancestor, my ninth great-grandfather, Thomas Blossom, who's also an ancestor of George W. Bush and Barack Obama, who was originally on the Speedwell, only came over years later.
So the Plymouth colony is never formed. As strange as this sounds, this isn't all that impactful, as many of the tales around Plymouth and the first Thanksgiving are essentially myths.
And look at Boston there, because it looks very different if you look at a modern map, because a lot of modern Boston is actually land that is artificial, that was filled in some of this water area. So a lot of where you see water at this point in the 17th century is now land.
While Plymouth has a cultural importance for the Union, Boston is the real foundation of Massachusetts and New England as we know it. English colonization would not stop. It was not uncommon for boats to sink while crossing the Atlantic, so the loss of the Mayflower was a minor setback in England. England already attempted numerous failed colonies. Roanoke.
And that's a fair point, that other people would have come. And it's important to note, too, that when the Mayflower first arrives, they don't arrive at Plymouth Rock right away. So Plymouth is down here a little south of where Boston is, and that's not where they first stop. They actually stop out here on this cape. That little kind of curly arm of Massachusetts. They stop out there, and that's where they do the Mayflower Compact. That's where they stop and kind of figure out, what are we going to do, because they didn't arrive where they thought they were going to arrive, and it was only later on that they come over then to the mainland.
Oak, Popham, and Cooper's Cove. Despite these setbacks, by 1620, they'd established multiple settlements. Newfoundland in 1610,
Yep.
Henricus in 1611.
That's a great point. Newfoundland is older than Plymouth, but as Americans, we learn about Jamestown 1607 and then Plymouth 1620, but because those are the first English settlements in what became the United States. You've got New Amsterdam, New Netherlands here.
Berkeley 100 in 1619, which also had their own Thanksgiving on December 4th, 1619, 2 years before Plymouth, but the most famous and successful was Jamestown, formed in 1607, birthed in Virginia. The colonies gave European states a place to send problematic groups easing domestic governance. Huguenots, Quakers, Puritans, Pilgrims, and Catholics all developed their own...
Great point. He just mentioned a whole bunch of those. The Huguenots were one. The Presbyterians later on are heavily persecuted in Scotland, and so a lot of what Americans call Scots-Irish, which would be people from Scotland or people from the Ulster, what is now Northern Ireland, come over as Presbyterians. A lot of Presbyterian Scots-Irish settle.
Communities in America. The Pilgrims, contemporarily known as the English Dissenters, were considered religious fanatics, and there would be few mourners when the Mayflower sunk. They wanted to remove the king's role in the Church of England, viewing Anglicans as too Catholic and inherently corrupted, desiring new, separate church congregations based on the early Christians without the pomp of their day.
Which is why they're called separatists. They didn't want to be a part of the Church of England. Which is kind of interesting when you think about the fact that the Church of England started as a break-off from the Roman Catholic Church.
While understandable today, at that time, these ideas were inconceivable for Anglicans, Lutherans, and Catholics. For England, at least the Puritans in Jamestown only wanted to simplify the Church of England through reformations, not destroy it.
And that happens a lot too. I mean, a lot of times the Lutheran movement, Martin Luther didn't start out to form his own denomination of Christianity. He wanted to fix what he saw as broken with the Catholic Church.
The Mayflower was not the first wave of exploration. Europeans had been in the Americas for over 100 years. England was late to the game and needed to catch up. The financial incentive was simply too high to end English expeditions as France, Spain, Portugal, Holland, and Sweden raced to claim the New World. Many wealthy Englishmen invested in colonial projects, gaining rights to the abundance of American resources: timbers, furs, tobacco, and fish.
Yeah, and they start these joint stock corporations which become incredibly powerful, like the British East India Company, which is really a nation state unto itself that people can invest in because, yeah, a lot of these settlements are not about religious freedom. They're about making a buck. They're companies, they're corporations that are looking to make money for their investors.
This was critical for colonial survival, as Europe had huge demands for fish, which America had in abundance. So as European fishermen arrived and exports skyrocketed, investors recouped lucrative profits. Despite all this, the biggest draw was the land. Unlike Europe, where every inch was hotly contested by fellow Christians with equal arms, the Americas had a few primitive pagans, hardly any match.
Yeah, think about if you are in Europe and it's been centuries of all the land's taken. It's just the only way you can get more is to take it from somebody else, from another country that's equally, if not more powerful than you are. Suddenly, there's this huge continent that's way bigger than Europe. Two continents, really, if you think about North and South America, that's way bigger than Europe, and all there are is just a few pesky Indians that we have to deal with. I hope you understand the tone in which I'm saying that. So there's all this land. It's an opportunity. It's a big opportunity.
Any European state could stake a claim to the huge swaths of America. All they needed was a few hundred settlers to survive the first few years, and wealth would surely follow. New royal charters were issued by the king, establishing companies like the Virginia, Newfoundland, Summer Isles, and Plymouth companies. American land was too fertile, so other settlements were coming, like the Wasagasset colony and the Cape Ann settlement. Once the royal charter was granted to the Massachusetts Bay colony in 1629, thousands of Puritans settled in Boston, so other charters were imminent.
That's when if you look, you see, Plymouth for the first few years is kind of small, it kind of barely survived. Same thing with Jamestown, but within a generation or so, Virginia and Massachusetts just explode with people.
Colonial rule for America was nearly identical without Plymouth. New settlements were formed along the eastern seaboard as British settlers slowly pushed the natives back, though many died from the introduction of European diseases.
I think he makes a great point here. Would Plymouth failing really have slowed things down? Because you had a failure of the Roanoke colony just a generation before Jamestown. So it wasn't going to stop the westward movement of people from Europe to the New World.
England and France choked out the Dutch and Swedes, rapidly expanding their possessions as settlements turned to cities, while the British colonial population skyrocketed to nearly 2 million. After pushing their competition out, tensions rose between Britain and France. A young George Washington was sent to defend the construction of British forts, but met French resistance, defeating the French
and started a world war. George Washington started a world... I mean, he didn't really, but it's fun to say. I mean, he probably did start what we call the French and Indian War here.
The Battle of Jumonville Glen in 1754, which began the French and Indian War, and the 7 Years' War. 9 years later, when the fighting stopped, the Treaty of Paris stripped France of almost all North American lands.
Yeah, but remember he talked earlier about the importance of fishing? I think the French did get to hold on to some fishing rights in the Newfoundland area.
Well, in Europe, Prussia held on to Silesia, cementing its place as a great power. Without France as a boogeyman, and as the British mistreatments and abuses of the colonies increased, the Boston Tea Party protested the Unjust Tea Act. Disguised as Indians with mohawks and face paint, Paul Revere led the Sons of Liberty on December 16, 1773, to destroy the equivalent of $1.7 million of today's money in tea.
And you can go to Boston today and visit the site where this happened, and they'll even let kids throw like a box of tea into the water, which is tied to a rope, so they pull it back in. But
dumping it in the Boston harbor. Britain responded with the intolerable acts, fueling the fires of revolution as the First Continental Congress convened in September 1774, organizing militias and tying the colonies together. In 1775, Mad King George declared Massachusetts in a state of rebellion, demanding the rebels
he wasn't mad yet. That came later.
Surrender their weapons, resulting in the battles of Lexington and Concord on April 19th, kicking off the American Revolution. On July 4th, 1776, the Second Continental Congress issued the Declaration of Independence.
Great point there. We've talked about this before, but in case you aren't familiar with it, why July 4th? Well, July 2nd, the resolution for independence is approved. So John Adams thought July 2nd would be the day everybody would remember. He wrote a letter to his wife Abigail talking about how July 2nd would be celebrated with fireworks and parades and all this stuff. July 4th, they approved the final wording of the Declaration of Independence. And then on August 2nd, they begin signing the Declaration of Independence, the one that we know today that's in the National Archives. Because they had to order that copy to be made. And so it took a few weeks for that to happen. And then they started signing on August 2nd.
After 6 years of brutal fighting, America, with the help of France, Spain, and the Netherlands, defeated the Redcoats, culminating in the Union victory over General Cornwallis at the Battle of Yorktown on October 19, 1781. 2 years later, the Treaty of Paris was signed on September 3, 1783.
Notice that painting was never finished.
Formally ending the war as Britain acknowledged American independence. The states acquired all the lands east of the Mississippi River, excluding Canada, where many Loyalists fled to. The first federal republic, based on the consent of the governed, was established, a beacon of freedom across the globe, triggering the age of revolutions and forever changing mankind. Many aspects of the revolution changed as some of the founding fathers had heritage directly to the Mayflower, like John and Samuel Adams.
In fact, if you are an American and you have roots that go back to colonial times, there's a pretty decent chance you've got ancestors on the Mayflower. Millions of people do. It's not nearly as unique as one might think. A lot of U.S. presidents, for example, have ancestors on the Mayflower. My ancestor on the Mayflower was a guy named George Soule, who was an indentured servant to the Winslow family. And I've actually visited his grave there in Massachusetts. Pretty cool. Highly recommend that you visit the area known as Plymouth Patuxet, which is like a living history settlement that's got not only the Plymouth colony kind of rebuilt very near to the site where it was originally, but also Patuxet, which is kind of a Native American settlement to show you how they lived. And you can interact with these actors who talked the way that they talked and who are portraying these people who lived in this village. My kids got to play games that kids would have played. It's really, really cool stuff.
Adams' diplomatic efforts in Europe were invaluable, but someone else filled the role during the Revolution, likely Thomas Jefferson. Samuel Adams was a major player in the Sons of Liberty, and a critical voice that shaped American republicanism. Both were descended from John and Priscilla Alden, and her father, William Mullins. The three were passengers on the Mayflower and original settlers of the Plymouth colony.
My great-great-grandmother was a Mullins. I wonder sometimes if she's descended. I haven't gotten back that far on her line.
There exists here, but as the only influential founding fathers with Mayflower heritage, the Revolution wouldn't be drastically different. After winning freedom, the United States struggled under the Articles of Confederation as the central government was largely ineffective. The Continental Congress was superseded by the states, and without a powerful executive, the strong figures of the day like George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, Alexander Hamilton, James Madison, and many more were not involved in the federal government, as many worried over America's future. George Washington put it best in his letter to the Virginia governor Benjamin Harrison on January 18, 1784.
And that would be Benjamin Harrison, I think the fifth, who signed the Declaration of Independence, or the Constitution, I don't remember which, but he would be the father of William Henry Harrison, the president, and therefore the great-grandfather of Benjamin Harrison, the president.
Labeling the federal government a half-starved, limping government that appears to be always moving upon crutches and tottering at every step. The weakness of the Articles of Confederation were exacerbated by Shays' Rebellion in 1786. Led by Daniel Shays, a veteran of the Revolutionary War who fought at the Battle of Bunker Hill, He, like many veterans, had become destitute as the government failed to pay them their wages.
And there's corruption almost from the very beginning in the federal government because of these promises and these bonds and things like that a lot of speculators came in and bought for pennies on the dollar, knowing that they were going to eventually have their full value, and they basically took advantage of all of these veterans to make a quick buck.
Massachusetts raised taxes to pay off its wartime debts. Sick of the governmental mismanagement, farmers and many in the lower classes rose up, shut down the courts, and attacked the Springfield Armory to gain supplies.
When your country is born out of a revolutionary spirit, you can't expect that the minute you win your independence, that revolutionary spirit's going to disappear. You have Shays' Rebellion. You later have the Whiskey Rebellion in southwestern Pennsylvania. And in both cases, the federal government's like, nope, not happening. So it's interesting that a government born out of that kind of revolutionary spirit then turns around and squashes future revolts.
The federal government had no funds to raise an army to defeat Shays, so Massachusetts raised their own militia, under the command of Lieutenant Governor Benjamin Lincoln, who had served as a major general during the Revolution.
And who had actually been the one who received the surrender of General O'Hara, who was the second in command of Cornwallis at Yorktown. And later surrendered, I think, Toulon to Napoleon?
Quickly put down the rebellion in 1787 and captured their leaders. To the elites of most states, this was a signal that the government needed reforms, and the Constitutional Convention was called in Philadelphia.
I always love this picture because I love how Alexander Hamilton is staring at Benjamin Franklin in this picture. I don't know what that's about, but it's fascinating.
Create a stronger federal government. After months of fierce debate, James Madison's Virginia Plan served as the basis for the new federal government, which we all know today.
Which is why he's called the father of the Constitution.
Legislative, executive, and judicial branches of the government. While the Constitution was being ratified by the states, Washington was unanimously elected in 1788 as the first president, but the vice presidency was open. Although formal parties did not yet exist, those in favor of the strong federal government formed by the Constitution were known as Federalists, while Anti-Federalists were opposed or unsure of the Constitution, wishing to preserve states' rights. Without John Adams, the main VP candidates were John Jay, the Secretary of Foreign Affairs, John Rutledge, the former governor of South Carolina, John Hancock, the Massachusetts governor, Samuel Huntington, the Connecticut governor, and Benjamin Lincoln, Lieutenant Governor of Massachusetts, who just put down Shays' Rebellion. Each was a strong Federalist, and Hancock was eventually selected to serve with Washington. Nothing changed under the Washington administration. Even the proclamation of Thanksgiving...
I'm not sure that I think John Adams is any less prominent just because there's no Mayflower, unless he's just saying John Adams doesn't exist in this scenario because of the Mayflower going down.
November 26, 1789 remained. The practice of days of Thanksgiving predated the Pilgrims in Plymouth and was not linked with the Pilgrims until the late 19th and early 20th century.
Yeah, that's a great point. You know, I've always found it fascinating that we talk about our modern Thanksgiving holiday as being connected to the Pilgrims when really our modern holiday was born out of the American Civil War. If you ever get a chance, read Abraham Lincoln's Thanksgiving Proclamation. It's powerful when you consider what was going on in the world, in the United States, with a bloody civil war that kills 750,000 people. The way he worded that is really quite something.
As the events became important to the American mythos. The Whiskey Rebellion was put down in 1791 after Pennsylvania failed to quell its people. Jefferson and Hamilton feuded as the party divide became a reality, while a national bank was formed as Washington effectively governed as a Federalist, heeding their counsels. In 1794, the Jay Treaty, designed by Hamilton and negotiated by John Jay, was signed with Britain. This saw Britain abandon forts in the Northwest Territory and resolve debts from the American Revolution, preventing war with Britain and effectively tying American interests with British ones, while publicly...
Which is what Hamilton wanted. There was always, in addition to the kind of Federalist versus Anti-Federalist thing between Hamilton and Jefferson, there was also kind of this, are we going to be closer tied to Britain or are we going to be closer tied to France? And Jefferson was very much a Francophile, whereas Hamilton was much more about modeling things after Britain and being close with Britain.
Defending the French. The Jeffersonian Republicans, the original Anti-Federalists, were generally Francophiles, as the French were in the midst of their own revolutionary wars against the European aristocracy. So, they denounced the treaty as a betrayal of the revolutionary spirit.
Yep. Yeah, and that was the thing. Oh my gosh, you're going right back to the British, who were the ones that we rebelled against in the first place. And, a lot of that debate was going on even with the Constitution being formed. Hamilton wanted to model the federal government very much after the British parliamentary system, complete with life peers and everything.
The first real changes take place in the 1796 election, as without John Adams, Thomas Jefferson defeats the Federalist candidate Thomas Pinckney, South Carolina's former governor. Essentially, a repudiation of...
I don't know. Wouldn't the vice president under George Washington probably still win in that scenario? Who knows?
Washington's policies. Although a seemingly minute change, electing Jefferson earlier changes the Union. The Jeffersonians were Francophiles, so there's no XYZ affair or quasi-war with France, as America distanced itself from Britain in favor of France, especially as Napoleon strung together victory after victory. Jefferson was a staunch defender of free speech, so
that's Stephen Delane playing Jefferson in John Adams, which is a fantastic series if you ever watch it.
Alien and Sedition Acts were ever implemented, meaning future acts like Wilson's Espionage Act of 1917 and Sedition Act of 1918 would be deemed unconstitutional.
That's a great point, because those were based on the Alien and Sedition Acts, which parts of those are still on the books.
John Marshall was never appointed, leaving the courts far weaker than the executive branch. The federal government was shaped by Jefferson, who, unlike Washington, had no qualms playing party politics, sending America down a more decentralized approach, diluting many powers to the states under the 10th Amendment, setting legal precedents that a state could reject anything they deemed unconstitutional.
Like nullification. So interesting. He does make a great point about how very different the United States could look if you don't have John Marshall and you don't have Marbury versus Madison. Where the Supreme Court basically appointed itself to be the arbiter of what is and is not constitutional. It was not something that was clearly spelled out in the Constitution. The court just said, we're going to start determining that. And then they've always done it since then. And that gave the Supreme Court a ton of power, which we still see to this day. I do believe wholeheartedly that had Jefferson succeeded Washington, that it would be a looser not a confederation, still a federal system. It would not be as strong a federal government as we end up seeing.
Dramatically weakening D.C. Northern industrialization was hampered as Jefferson favored the yeomen, farmers who only produced enough to feed their families.
Yeah, that's we call those subsistence farmers. Basically, you're farming to stay alive. You're not farming to make a profit.
Plans protected them at the expense of city elites, as high tariffs were raised on imported goods, as the cities were the ones who imported said goods, and Jefferson viewed cities as cesspools of filth and corruption.
He did.
Poor and unlanded whites received voting rights earlier as he advocated for increasing voter turnout, giving more people say in the government, while pushing the populist agenda of westward expansion and the assimilation of the Indians, resulting in an earlier Louisiana Purchase. Militias remained the only state...
Wouldn't have been that much earlier, though, because Louisiana Purchase still happens pretty early in our history.
...army, as he saw professional military as a burden, meaning the Union would be in no position to send a navy after the Barbary pirates or declare war on Britain in 1812.
I do agree with that, because it was the quasi-war with France under John Adams that caused us to start building a real navy.
Although Britain and America likely wouldn't fight, the American rejection of British overtures, instead favoring the French ones, would forever change the history of the Union and the globe in ways unimaginable.
So that was interesting. So basically what it boils down to in his timeline, the point of divergence is that without the Mayflower successfully arriving in America, you don't get a John Adams. And how does the country look differently from the late 18th century on, because John Adams isn't there to be vice president? Of course, John Adams is the one who made the motion in the first place to make George Washington the commander-in-chief of the army. So would that have even happened? Would Washington have risen? Who knows? All really interesting questions to consider. So that was interesting. I liked it. I thought it was cool. It gives us something fun to talk about in the grand scheme of things. And like I said, he's got a lot of... I clicked on his channel so I could look and see what some of his other videos were. He's got a lot of other stuff here that we can take a look at. So if there's anything you see on this channel you think it'd be fun for me to take a look at, let me know in the comments section. And like I said, if you want to join the Discord server, just sign up as a patron or a member at any level, and you'll have the link available to you there to be able to join our private Discord server. Thanks for watching. We'll see you again soon.